didn't have the joy that a lot of people have of listening to and hearing about all these wonderful stories that are in the Old Testament. These stories that I think sometimes we take for granted. And so I would suggest to moms and dads, there's some really great stories in the book of Genesis. Spend some time with your kids talking about those. The other thing that fascinates me about Genesis is I'm an only child. I did marry into a family. Sandy's mama had 12 brothers and sisters, and her dad had 13 brothers and sisters. So I've been kind of fascinated because as we look at what we're going to be talking about, we're going to see some pretty big families. Now, the biggest difference is Sandy's mom there was only one mother, and in the case of Sandy's dad, there was only one mother. We're going to see multiple wives in this case. And I guess the other thing, from my perspective, I'm quite a few years older than JB, so I kind of look at things maybe a little bit differently than he would look at them. And he has been pretty much giving us a question to think about and then kind of building around that. Well, I'm going to take a little bit of different approach because I want to share with you some of those stories that I missed out on. And as I've said, our assignment that he gave us for tonight is chapter 37. Sunday, we're going to do chapter 50. And as we look at chapter 50, we're going to see the concept of forgiveness really coming forth in chapter 50. But we'll also see this this evening to some extent. But what we really see as we build up to chapter 7 is the providence of God. And what's your thought about what does providence mean to you? Anybody got a thought about what is providence?
God providing for our future.
Okay. God providing for our future. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? I'm sorry? Okay, buying our insurance. And this is sort of a textbook-like definition. God's providence is God carrying provision for His people as He guides us in our journey of faith through life, accomplishing His purposes in us. And that's pretty much what you were saying. So we want to look for that in these stories that we're going to be looking at as we build up to Genesis. And there are all kinds of examples that you can turn to in the New Testament that share with us this concept of providence taking place in our lives as well as in the lives of these Old Testament characters. Well, if we think about providence, we've got to go all the way back to Abraham, because that's where the first promise that God made to His people was to Abraham. And we know the covenant promise in Genesis 22. The covenant promise given by Abraham was, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you, Abraham, have done this and have not withheld your son Isaac, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. That's where it begins, with that promise that God made to Abraham. And yet, as we look at Abraham's life, we wonder how in the world this promise could be carried out. They were old, too old to have children, and then they had a child. And we see that this promise passed through Abraham's descendants, to Isaac, to Jacob, and then to Joseph. And in the case of Jacob, we find that the promise was made to Jacob that he was to go from where he was and to go up north. And he was told that the land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants, and all the families of the earth will be blessed. And behold, I will be with you and keep you wherever you go, and will bring back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised to you. So we've got, starting with Abraham and Isaac, and now we're to Jacob, and God reiterates that promise to them. And he says, I'll bring you back to this land that I promised to you. And we know that the promise was made to Abraham, and in Exodus we find that not only is it the God of Abraham and Isaac, but we now find out that it's the God of Jacob as well in Exodus 3:15. So this is kind of the map of his early travels. He starts out in this area down below in the lower part of what's now Palestine or Israel, and he goes up a little bit further, and we find that at this particular point he just sort of settles here for a little bit, and then he moves all the way up to Haram, and there's where he is for 20 years. 7 years he had to work for. You ready to do that? All right. So, I mean, there's so much that we can learn from these stories that are here and remind ourselves that there's a lot to be gained as we think about these stories. So he's up there for 7 years for the first wife. He worked 7 years for the second wife, and then 6 additional years. And his wealth grew, and then God said, go back home. And so he heads back down, and his father-in-law comes down, and they have a little confrontation, and they decide that they'll divide. And then he goes on a little bit further, and he finds that little story where he's now in this area, and he is wrestling with some divine being. And I think Jonathan thought maybe it was God. It could be an angel. It could be whatever you want to make of that. And then he finally ends up at Shechem after all of this takes place. So there's a lot of traveling that takes place over the course of time. Well, the question then we have to ask ourselves is, who was Joseph? And as we think about this and we look through that family tree, and remember I said I was an only child in large families, really meant a lot to me. And you can see as we get down to Jacob, in the end he has 12 sons and a daughter. And this has got to be, Jews look back on the Old Testament, particularly the book of Genesis, this is where the victory starts. They now can understand the promise that was made to Abraham and to Isaac and now Jacob. And Jacob has the family that will then be the tribes that inhabit the nation of Israel. Now, as we look at this, we also see some really strange things, and it's always amazed me. If I were writing this book, I think I'd leave out a lot of the negative. But if you look at this line, we've got Jacob, the wife that he really didn't want, Leah, and Judah, who gets in a lot of trouble with Tamar. And then the son that was supposed to be the second son came out as the first son. And it's through that line that we find King David and Jesus. So not only is it a great story for the Jews, but we can see the beginning for us. Follow through this lineage, this heritage that's there. And then we can follow Levi up to Moses. And then Esau down here in Edom. We'll see that in one of the chapters later on, which JB has already gone over. So the hope really is the people of the promise, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And you can see how God's promise is repeated over and over again. But with Jacob's family, we can see how the culmination and the 12 tribes that ultimately settle into the land of Israel are developed. So we're going to go through Genesis 29 through 39 at a pretty rapid pace, and then get us to chapter 37, which was our assigned chapter. And as we go through this, I think we're going to see that there's a lot of forgiveness that happens along the way. Well, in chapter 29, we find that Jacob goes up to this far area up in the north, and he's around a well, and he sees this really cute girl that's a shepherdess, and he kind of falls in love, love at first sight type of thing. And he opens the well, and she can then water her sheep. She goes back and she tells her father, Laban, that one of your relatives is here. And so that all takes place. And then eventually Jacob makes a deal with Laban to marry Rachel. And so what happens? After 7 years, he works hard and he labors hard, and he goes to bed one night. They had a party. And this is another thing. Be careful what you do when you go to parties, because you may get yourself into trouble, because he wakes up the next morning with the wrong wife. So you got to be careful about that. And he marries Leah after 7 years working, thinking he's going to get Rachel. And so then he negotiates with Laban again, and he says, 7 years and you can have Rachel. But he does a better deal this time, doesn't he? He gets Rachel in a week, even though he has to work 7 more years to pay for it. And so we see then the children of Rachel, Reuben being the oldest. And then we get into Genesis 30, and here's where we see one of these unfortunate situations. Here we see Rachel complaining. She complains to her husband saying, "Why don't I have children?" Well, it's obvious it's not Jacob's fault, because he's already got 4 sons. And so he says to her, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And so Rachel then says, "Well, I'm just going to do what my grandmama did." What did her grandmama do when she couldn't have children? She substituted her maid, and so what does Rachel do? She substitutes her maid, and resulting in the base of more sons to Jacob. And so we get 2 more sons, and one of these sons, Naphtali, has kind of a strange name. It means struggle or conflict. And Ruth will even name the resulting child to reflect belief that it is a struggle between her and her sister. And we see this, don't we, as we go on, the conflict that exists between the 2 of them. And then Rachel sends in her maid. And now Leah says, well, I'm going to get in the game too. She sends in her maid, and there are a couple of additional sons. And then there's kind of an interesting situation. Reuben is out in the field, and he brings back some mandrakes. And if you look at Psalms 7:13, the mandrake gives a smell, and our gates are all a matter of pleasant fruit, new and old, which I've laid up for thee, O my beloved. It's an aphrodisiac, supposedly, the mandrake is. So Leah works out a deal with Rachel. I'll give you some of the mandrake that Reuben brought in, but I get to go tonight with our husband Jacob. And so she goes in, and two more sons are born, and the one daughter, at least the one daughter that we know about, was born. And then Leah, after Leah, then Rachel goes in with her husband, and that's when Joseph is born. So we now have 11 boys and one girl at this stage. And so then Jacob has been there now 14 years, and he's getting a little bit tired, and he works out a deal with Laban for the last part of time. And he basically says, look, I'll take the runts, the scrub of the flock, and you have the good stuff, and we'll keep them separated. Now, I don't know how this happens, but again, this is providence, I think, where he puts these reeds that he's at the water trough, and for whatever reason, the bad animals develop better animals, and so his flocks grow, and he becomes quite rich and exceedingly prosperous. And then we get into Genesis 31, and we now find out that Laban has, in addition to the two daughters, some sons, and the sons are saying, we got to get rid of Jacob because in some ways he was to be considered the oldest son and therefore the one who would inherit his stuff. But now they're the natural born sons that are there. And so they accuse him of being a thief. And if you think about Jacob, he was pretty much a scoundrel, wasn't he, early on in his life? He robbed his brother of not only his birthright but the promise, and he deceived his own father by doing this. But now he's receiving the blessings from the God. And in Genesis 31:3 we read, return to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I'll be with you. So now God has told him, you're going to leave this area of Hebron, and you're going to go back to the area of Canaan. And so Jacob flees. Good old Rachel decides that she wants to take the household idols, so she takes those with her. And Laban follows, almost like a raiding party. And there's a little insert in there where we can see, again, God's providence working. What does he say to Laban? It's up on the screen. Read it.
Be careful he not speak to Jacob.
Okay. So he was cautioned not to do something that would cause Jacob harm. And so he gets there, and he reminds Jacob that he can't do anything good or bad or cause you any harm, but you got something of mine, and I want to find it. So Jacob says, okay, search all the tents. And here's a rich guy, and the only way I'm sure that he could survive this, he had 4 tents. One for each of his 4 wives. And I suspect that they were yards apart, but I don't know that. But I don't know how he handled 4 wives. I can't handle 1. I don't know about the rest of you, but 4. But anyway, so he comes down and he begins to look through all of this and searches his property. And Jacob says to Laban, look, you've really embarrassed me. You've gone through all of my property and you didn't find anything. Why didn't he find the household items? Anybody remember why he didn't find them? She was sitting on them, but why would Laban not look beneath her? I'm sorry? She was in her menstrual cycle, and that was something that you just did not do. So she sat there on top of the idols, and so there was a little deceit in this, because he then says, well, you know, you sit here in front of my relatives, and you accuse me, and so let's decide this. And I worked for you for 14 years to get these 2 wives, another 6 years. to work out all of this. And, during that time, you changed my wages 10 times. So let's just get this thing sorted out. And so at the end of all of this, there was a covenant between Jacob and Laban. They put out some stones, and Laban was to stay on this side, and Jacob was to stay on the other side. So in 32, Jacob departs Haran, and he goes south because God told him to do that. And he said, I'll be with you as you go. And he prays to the God of Abraham and Isaac, remember your promise. You told me to return and that you'll be with me. And in his prayer, he confesses, I am not worthy, and please deliver me. And then the terror comes in to Jacob's life because he hears who's coming to see him. His brother Esau, who he had been very, very deceitful with early on. And so what Jacob does is that he splits into a couple of groups, and he sends out all these presents, no cows, but sheep and goats and donkeys and camels in 3 different waves, hoping that Esau will accept this and forgive him. As you think about Jacob, he's really struggled all of his life, hadn't he? Early on, he struggled with Esau, and then with his uncle Laban. But his biggest struggle comes at a place called Peniel, which is almost down to where he finally settles. And this is where he has this wrestling match with a God, an angel, some spiritual being, and we find out that his name is changed. It's changed to Israel. But not only that, he has a physical ailment. He's got something wrong with his hip, and even today, the Jewish people won't eat the ligament from a hip in the animals that they slaughter, which goes back to this. During this fight, or this match with whoever it was, the individual he was fighting with asked Jacob what his name was, and Jacob said what his name was, and he asked this individual, what is your name? And the individual did what? He refused to respond. But if we go over to Exodus chapter 3, 14 and 15, we find out God's name, I am, I am. So it takes a little while, but we do finally get that question answered. And then in chapter 33, here comes Esau with 400 men. I think I'd be a little bit frightened knowing that my brother, who I had not been very nice to early on, was coming towards me with 400 men. So he again divides his family. And it's kind of, I think, a little bit of favoritism here again. He puts one of the handmaids first with her children, the other handmaid second, Leah third, and Rachel, his favorite, as the last one. And the whole plan was, hopefully, that by the time they get all the way back to Rachel, Esau will be okay. So Jacob goes out and he bows down to Esau, and it's really a phenomenally happy reunion. And then Jacob travels down to Canaan. He lives outside the city on land that he purchased. And the reason he doesn't go into the city is because it's a Canaanite city. They worship other gods. And then in chapter 34, we see an interesting story, and maybe it's not a children's story, but it's certainly an interesting story. They're in the city of Shechem, and the prince, Shechem, is son of Homar, the Hittite priest, and he actually rapes Diana, the daughter of Jacob. And a lot goes on in all of this, and they make a negotiation that if all the men of the city will be circumcised, then we'll be like brothers and we'll intermarry. But that's not what happens. We find that Simeon and Levi are the main leaders in this. They go into the city, they kill everybody, and they take all the possessions. And as a result of this, then Jacob is they call him obnoxious, that he's not well liked here, and so it's time again for them to move on. And so in Genesis 35, Jacob returns to Bethel, and God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar to God who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother." This is the fifth time thus far that God comes to Jacob. And this is the first time that God commanded him to build an altar. Now, he's built altars earlier, but this is the first time that God commanded him to build an altar. And one of the things that they had to do was to get rid of everything that reflected foreign gods. So what did Rachel have to give up? She had to give up those household idols that she had and all the jewelry and other stuff, and to eliminate all of those idols or anything that related to that. And I don't know, somebody can help me. I have no idea why Deborah is in here, but she passes away. She was the nursemaid to Rachel, but she passes away in this chapter. And then we find that God renews his covenant with Jacob and reaffirms the name change in Genesis. And this is the passage which basically says, "A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you." And God then renews that promise. Rachel has their last son, Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth. So we now have all 12 sons. The 12 tribes are ready to be formed, as I said in the earlier slide. And then Isaac dies at 180, and Jacob and Esau bury him in Hebron. And this just kind of shows you once again the family, Leah's children, the two handmaids, and Rachel's two children. And you can see the passage through to Jesus, King Saul. And I want you to keep in mind as we get into chapter 37, Reuben and also Judah, because they play a role in chapter 37. Remember, Reuben is the oldest son, and Judah is a son that wandered away. And in chapter 36, there's just a genealogy of Esau's descendants, and that becomes important in chapter 38 because Judah now departs from his brothers, and he marries a Canaanite, Shula, and they have 3 sons. And so we find that Tamar marries the first son. That son is killed by God. She marries the second son, and that son is killed by God. And we find that the whole purpose of what was going on was based in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapter 25, that if a husband dies, then the next in kin brother would take that lady, that woman, and his wife. Well, now the issue that took place here with the second son was he realized that if he had a son with her, that son would become the primary heir, But if he had no children with her, then he remained the primary heir, and he would get the greatest inheritance proportion. And if you go through that chapter, you will see all of that happening. And then Judah promises Tamar, well, when my youngest son gets of age, I will give him to you. And he reneges when the child becomes of age. And then we know the rest of that story has to do with her playing the harlot. And this is another classic example of dumb men. Think about this. He's caught with a harlot, and what does he give her? His driver's license, his passport, every bit of information he could possibly give to her. You know, his signet ring, his cord, his staff. So now she knows everything about who he is, but she has no idea. She knows who he is, but he has no idea who she is. So, as we know, he makes the comment, well, she's not important, just let her burn. And that goes to Leviticus 29:9. If a priest's daughter plays the role of a harlot, they should be burned. And she becomes pregnant, and she has twins. And here's another interesting little twist with twins. They put a red cord around the one, and I have no idea how they did this, but they put a red cord around the foot of the one that was supposed to be the elder. But God works His way, and the younger became the elder. And so Perez ended up being the older of the two children, even though the other one had the red cord. And he does say afterwards in Judah says in verse 26, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to my third son. So, as we kind of bring us all together, we're seeing Jacob's family is kind of falling apart. His daughter was abused by Shechem. Simon and Levi take revenge on Shechem. Reuben, his firstborn, abuses Beulah, one of his concubine wives, and Isaac passes away, and the brothers in chapter 37 sell Joseph into slavery. And Judah departs and seeks Canaanite friends. So you can see this is a promised family, that the whole of the promise would come through them. And yet you can see they're like many families with troubles. And yet, because of God's providence, the promise that He made to Abraham, reaffirmed to Isaac, and to Jacob, will come true as we continue to follow it through the Old Testament. So, having said all of that, we're now into chapter 37, which was our assignment. And as we think about chapter 37, it's really an interesting story again of sibling rivalry, a favorite child. And this is something that, to me, is extremely important for us to remember. Favoritism with children is an absolute unacceptable thing. You got to love all of your children with all of your heart the same amount. The case here was his favorite wife and his youngest son. Well, we only have a favorite wife. At the time, he was the youngest son. Benjamin comes along later. Yeah, at the time, it was his youngest son. And it's just something that we have to not allow ourselves to fall into the trap that was there. Joseph was 17 when his journey begins, or at least the recording. We find that his dad loved him more than he loved the other sons. And I think that has a lot to do with it was his favorite wife. He gave him a long tunic, and it says multicolored tunic, but it was some type of covering that set him apart from his siblings. It's like, me giving one of my kids a Mercedes SL $100,000 car, and the others some old beat-up pickups. He really set Joseph up to have an issue. His brothers, you are not surprised, they were jealous of him because, as the text tells us, he loved Joseph the most. And Joseph had two dreams, and again, this is providence coming in, these two dreams. The first dream was bad enough. He basically had a dream that said, we're out in the field and we're picking our harvest, and we've got these 12 bundles, and I stand up and you guys fall down and bow down to me. And the brothers took it like you would expect the brothers to take it. Hey, you're the young kid. Who do you think you are telling us that we're going to have to bow down to you? And then the second dream was of the sun and the moon and the stars. And basically in this one, it was saying, Mom and Dad, as well as my brothers, you're all going to have to bow down to me. And I think that his father, Israel, was intrigued by his dream because he kept it in mind, although he wasn't particularly happy with it. Now, the next thing that we see in this chapter 37 is that Jacob tells Joseph, you need to go check on your brothers. They're out tending sheep, and so you need to go check on them. Now, he'd already come back and reported on them earlier that they were doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and so now sends him out. And that's about a 50-mile course that he has to take from Hebron up to Shechem, and then he finds in Shechem they're not there, but they tell him he's up in Dothan, and so he's now up there. They see him coming in his fancy coat, whatever it was, and immediately they begin to make plans. It's interesting that Abraham built the first altar to God at Shechem, and also Jacob built one at the same place up at Shechem. So that's really an important particular location in that area, which is about 50 miles up, and then it's another 5 or so miles up to Dothan. So we go through, his brothers decide to kill him, and the older brother, Reuben, like a good older brother should be, said, no, we shouldn't kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit, and then I'll take him back to Dad when we go back home. So I think Reuben was acting like a good brother, but he also may have been trying to get back into Dad's good grace because he'd had an affair with one of the handmaids, Beulah. So anyway, they put him in, and when they are eating, some Ishmaelites come by, and one of the brothers, Judah, says, well, let's not kill him, let's just sell him and make a little money from him. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver. If you go over to Exodus 21:23, the worth of a slave at that particular time was about 30 pieces of silver. So maybe there's some bargaining that went on. But Joseph sold for less than at least what Exodus says later on should be the price. If you kill a slave, you had to pay this much for them. So the next thing they do is they take his coat and they smear blood on it, and they take it back to the father. and we find then that Joseph is off to Egypt. And one of the things that I've learned in studying the Old Testament, for the most part, when anybody goes back to Egypt, it's not good. There are some occasions when it was good, but most of the time when the Israelites go back to Egypt, it's not a particularly good thing. So we find then, let me skip over here. Yep. Okay, in an allegorical sense, when you think about that, Joseph probably represents Jesus, and his brothers represent the same people that turned Jesus over to the Romans at his death. So any comments or thoughts about this? As we covered a lot of ground, we didn't have those outstanding single question that JB puts up at the beginning. But I think the thing that I would leave you with in the last few minutes that we have is that there is a tremendous amount of practical information that one can gain by looking at these stories that we so often teach to our children, but we teach them as children's stories and not stories that will help us. And that's one of the things that I certainly missed in growing up, is having the opportunity to hear these stories until Sandy began teaching them to our children. And I was probably more fascinated than some of the kids were with some of these stories. But there's a lot of practical information and application that we can apply to our life, if anything more than, spending those 7 years getting ready for marriage. Any comments or thoughts? The whole bottom line practical thing is, look at these in light of your own life and see how they can help you live a better life. So I think we're out of time. We'll do chapter 50 next time, which is the end of the book. And I think that was the last bell, or it's coming up shortly. Yes, sir.
God does not lie. So you need to understand that His promises will come true.
Here is such a great comment, because we see it over and over again to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, all the way through. And in every single promise God has ever made. So that's a good thing for us to think about, because what has He promised us? Heaven. And He will get us there. Yep. Back to the Genesis chapter 1, back to that garden. Yep, great point.